Okay then, the Steps Collective, Garden Question Time edition. As always, we're going to start with the words. Steps show the easy place to start. It is often mentioned, even by the most experienced travellers in the regenerative space, that they're continually finding their way. If we are to follow, we must look for their footprints and consider where we might place our own first steps. Today, we're here to share stories about how regenerative journeys begin. Taking action is always easier when you see and hear how others have started. These stories will start in the early stages, with people alive to the unfolding environment around them. Hearing about the first steps of others can be a vital part of our own, and we will not walk alone. I should have put my teeth in for this, really. We help each other take these first steps towards a regenerative future, not as experts, but as parents, neighbours, colleagues, citizens, etc. Our stories are all different. To travel with efficiency and resilience, we must learn what works for others, to find a balance for ourselves between them. There is no single answer to guide you, but many questions to orientate by. We want to help people shape a regenerative design for life, navigating with uncertainty, switching between action and inspiration, moving before we think too much, and yet thinking before we go too far. Nobody can be certain what is around the next bend or over the next peak. Hold on to your considerate, open and thoughtful outlook in our time together. There are many paths up the same mountain. And Helen's throwing sticks for the dog. I can now hear the dog there as well. So, welcome to this special edition of the Steps Collective, which is fairly impromptu. We only set it up last week when we found out that I was going to be on Gardner's Question Time, which was originally something that I thought when they emailed, they just meant, can you put something on our website? If I knew it was going out in BBC Two, I might have spent longer than the kind of like the afternoon doing it that I did. But there we go. But it's it's something that's built on, I guess, a lot of the Steps Collective stuff that we've been doing this year so far. It's start small. It's just getting to do something then makes you think of other things and where you might take that as well. The video as it was last week was basically us, or me talking about our garden. That has led on to a bigger thing across the estate here, which we can get into later. But I wondered if we might start off by everyone, because not everyone knows each other, just saying hello, who they are, and what their favourite bit of the garden is.
Hey, I'm Claire. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So we moved out of London and found a bit of space, just over an acre. And so I've gone from having a small yard in London to having an enormous amount of space and a meadow. So my favourite bit of the garden is, whilst I love the wildness of it and I love all the nature, is the bit where I'm growing things. There's a little bit of, it's not a control thing in control sense, but growing stuff that we can eat, just seeing the sort of cycle of life, taking seeds out of the pepper we bought from the shops and then seeing it grow into things that we can then eat. So there's loads that I love about it. But at the moment, that's my favorite bit because it just feels like something that I can understand the dynamics, the systems that are in play, what's going on under the ground, whereas the rest of it is just so huge. I don't even know where to start. So it's quite nice to have that little bit that yeah, that I'm influencing, but also nature's doing its thing. If I set it up, the rest is happening.
That's lovely. There's like a little sense and respond thing going on where you're going, if I
Yeah.
dig this or poke this or feed this or
Yeah.
even just intentionally let go, what happens?
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. Who's next?
I'm happy to go if I think I might be one of the newer faces here. So yeah, thanks very much for welcoming me to the space. I'm Nick. I think I spotted this pop up on LinkedIn. So it might be through. We might have mutual connections, John, and things. So I'm very passionate about regenerative space. I work within sustainability consulting for my own consultancy business and work with B Corps, things like that. So a big part of this for me, though, is around I'm starting to look at third places and how I can work as a community with an idea that I've got with some down on the south coast. So we're down near Bournemouth. What we're trying to do is look at how can we use things like gardening and sharing of knowledge and all the kind of great things that come with that, the citizen sort of part of that, which is great. My favourite part of my garden is probably got a tree that I was told about 5 years ago was dead by a gardener, and I don't know how, but I've managed to bring it back to life. So it just keeps growing and growing. It's been a really cool thing because I've used it to hang things for the kids' parties. I've used it now; it's become big enough to be shade for the garden. So parts of the garden are now sort of thriving that were looking like they were getting a bit sun damaged. So yeah, it's kind of the idea of it being actually brought back to life. I'm not that good at gardening, so I'm quite happy.
That's brilliant to hear. Lovely to meet you.
And
That at some point today we should come back to that phrase, right? Being good at gardening is one of these funny things that you go. Anyway, well, I think we should come back to it because it is one of these things. It's almost like maths. People go, "Well, I'm either good at maths or I'm not, and I'm either good at gardening or I'm not." And you go, I'm not necessarily sure it's a kind of like you're given natural green fingers or not." But there we go. Um, who's next?
I'm happy to go
Jenny.
next. Oh,
Sorry, we popped at the same time then. Hello, I'm Jenny Lloyd. My thing is place-based systems change. I live in Brighton. I'm a consultant. But I'm also a keen lover of my garden, which, because it's Brighton, is small, but kind of courtyard garden. My favourite bit of it is the wall at the back because I have most amazing view. So I live just above the railway line, the cutting. As you come into the station in Brighton, you look up. It's my house and kind of Thames, and so it's like living on top of the cliff. So I've gone for an absolutely packed jungly type thing, and then you've got this kind of good view as well. So I kind of love it. I think it's probably my favourite part of my house and home. And I like what Claire was saying about growing stuff. So a few years ago, I started growing flowers from seeds. I'm really only interested in flowers and big leafy plants. I don't grow food. Much to my husband's chagrin. I think he'd be interested if we did it. But yeah, no one else in my family is interested. And I don't know. It's partly why I wanted to come and talk to people who are interested in things growing. Also, I don't know, I've got an itch to do something in Brighton, something about growing, but using growing spaces or spaces where things can grow as part of like an eco infrastructure for water runoff and things like that. I just anyway, so I'm playing with those ideas.
Nice, thank you, Jenny.
Jenny, I'm down the road, so should meet and have a chat.
Oh, who is that? Is that Claire? I didn't see his mouth.
Yeah, I was just saying I'm down the road, so maybe you should meet and have a chat in person.
Hamilton Road, steep.
Rosie, I think you were going to go next. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rosie. I'm a new joiner for the Steps Collective conversation. Lizzie kindly shared the invite with me because we've recently finished studying together. My favorite part, well, maybe I should tell you a bit more about me. Previously, I was a sustainability consultant, corporate sustainability consultant for 5 years. I've also worked in government and TV broadcasting. And then in the last year, I went down to Schumacher College to study regenerative economics to get a kind of more grassroots perspective on the whole sustainability change-making world. I have a very strong interest in nature. I did zoology originally at uni, and there's been a thread through everything that I've done since. I love my garden. I got a garden for the first time 3 years ago, and I designed it last year. And I was moving just earlier because I was like, I feel like I should be able to see my garden whilst we're talking about it, which I haven't actually fully achieved. I can see my neighbours, which is that's a whole nother story. But my favourite part is probably, at the moment, it's probably my sweet peas. I've grown them successfully for the first time this year, little toilet rolls in February, with the seeds in on my sort of by my back door, and they kind of grew up big enough, and then we planted the toilet rolls, so there's now a whole load of like disintegrating toilet rolls in my garden somewhere, but they've sort of transformed into this like wild patch of entangled sweet peas, and I get a bunch every morning that stinks my kitchen out in a really lovely way. So that's me.
Wonderful, thank you. Who's next?
I'm also fairly new. Shall I do one? Rosie, I share your joy with sweet peas. That's one of our very limited successes so far. Is a really good sweet pea harvest so far. So I'm Nathan. I retrained in countryside management about 10 years ago after doing lots of sort of project management-y type things. And a few years ago, I started running an arable farm in North Norfolk and took it through a sort of regenerative, organic sort of transition from intensive agriculture to a sort of to a much kinder model that was focused more on biodiversity and community engagement and soil rehabilitation. So I sort of went into my understanding of regenerative based on a fairly sort of narrow definition based on soil health. My interests have broadened. We came down to Devon. My wife is a Dartmoor girl, and we've got some space down here, and I've sort of been learning much more about regenerative and agroecology, and developed a particular interest in food systems. So did a course a little while ago at the Apricot Centre at Dartington that was really, really interesting. My food systems interest I'm looking at pursuing with a master's later on this year if I can. And I've also been doing some work on the side trying to support the development of a new business looking at regeneration of neglected places and spaces, but in particular how to sort of think in terms of layering up, if it's possible, all the various different sort of mechanisms to sort of support that. Now we've got biodiversity net gain and other sort of green finance opportunities available. So my interests are quite Catholic, and when John's slot on Gardener's World came up, I was interested to see that. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you. What have we not had? Andy, Helen, Lizzie.
I can introduce himself. Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, nice to see a few new faces here as well today. So I'm Andy. So I'm sort of part of the collective with John and Lizzie and Rob, who's not here. My background's in design and I suppose futures and imagination, and I'm generally interested in regenerative and all of that kind of stuff, ecological things, and how do we do a lot of the mindset shifts that we're going to need to live in a much better balance with the rest of the world, basically. And I suppose my favorite part of the garden, I do have some, I think I should pay attention to the fact that I've got an apple tree in the garden, which has clearly been planted quite a long time ago. It gives us quite a lot of apples. And so there's that whole kind of appreciating the intergenerational nature of someone bothering to plant an apple tree when you're not going to see much on an apple tree for quite a few years. So I'm reaping the harvest of that, whoever decided to do that. But also I kind of mow the sort of front half of the garden or keep that in a relatively good state. And then the bottom half of the garden, it makes it sound like I've got a huge garden. It's a fairly decent size. I'm in Brighton as well, by the way, Jenny, but I'm on the outskirts, so I've got a bit more space. But I kind of leave that to the rest of the garden itself and just let it. I don't even do like no mow May. I just do no mow whatsoever. So right now it's kind of pretty out of control, but I've got foxes. We've got foxes around here and things like that. So it's quite nice just to sort of leave it to its own devices and see where it goes, and to not worry too much about having quite an untidy garden at the other end of it.
Wonderful, thank you. It's a standoff now.
I can go next. So I'm Lizzie. It's lovely to see you all and meet some new faces. So I spent the first 15 years of career in strategy, digital innovation, service design, and then moved into facilitation and coaching and working with organizations, mostly quite large and international organizations, to facilitate change. And then over the last, I guess, 5, 6 years, became more aware of the disconnect between kind of the sort of I guess activism that I kind of grown up with, and environmental consciousness, and how separate that was from my professional work, and decided to spend more time thinking about how to integrate those things. Ended up at a business activism retreat at Findhorn in the middle of the pandemic, which was kind of a really catalyzing moment for me, I think. And then found my way to Schumacher with Rosie last September, and will complete my master's next year. And Nathan, we had a really wonderful, well, and freezing cold day at the Apricot Centre, which was a massive inspiration for how land can create space for so many things layered on top, and human and other than human, in this really kind of lovely way. For me, I very much relate to Nick, what you were saying, the kind of not good at gardening. So I've always lived in cities and urban environments. I am in 5 months' time moving to the most rural part of New Zealand, which is going to be kind of a huge change in all senses. But despite kind of living in urban environments, I've always been a barefoot person. And I was thinking about in the what's my favorite thing in the garden. And actually, rather than any sort of specific place, it is the experiences that the garden creates for me and my family. So that just feeling of being barefoot on the earth. And I live in Hackney in East London, on a very mixed estate in kind of the most urban environment in some senses. And yet that feeling is the same earth everywhere. And that's such a kind of very literally grounding feeling. But equally, the garden is the place that my kids last night in the thunderstorm were outside, also barefoot on the grass, kind of shrieking and running around in the rain. And that kind of ability for that space to kind of unlock the whole spectrum of emotions in a really powerful way. And so I guess for me, my favorite thing in essence is how it's a place to reset and kind of come back to myself. And I see that reflected in everyone else who lives in my house too. So that is the thing I appreciate most about it.
Thank you. Finally, Helen, I'll switch my mic off and then you put yours on. Go.
Hello, I'm Helen. I'm John's wife, and I'm the one who probably does all the planting in the garden. John might dispute that. He likes to do big infrastructure projects in the garden. I like to do the planting. I come from a family of gardeners who love gardening, have amazing gardens. So I'm a very unsatisfied gardener because I like my garden, but it never looks as nice as my parents' garden. But they always put loads of work into it. Um, and I think, in a way, John and I probably come at gardening from a different way from they do. My dad is always telling me, why don't you just use some Roundup on those weeds? And it's like, Dad, no, no. Our garden isn't about it looking pretty. Our garden is about, encouraging wildlife, encouraging um, insects and flowers. And what I'd really like to see is a focus on more native plants, being able to get more native plants into your garden, because I think that's one of the things that's really missing when you go to the garden centre. You go around the garden centre, or you buy a packet of seeds, and they're from all over the place, or they're grown in England, but they're not native plants. And I want to just have native plants that can attract native wildlife. So that would be a big thing for me. That would be very happy. And I love sweet peas, so I'm going to try the sweet peas in the toilet rolls next year. So great tip, thank you.
Thank you, unsatisfied gardener downstairs. But it's really interesting that kind of like a generational difference in approach to what gardeners are. And how much of how I've always been interested in how much of it for a previous generation has been about control, been about going sort of like, no, we are going to kind of like make this garden into the thing that we want it to be, just in this tiny little pot, and just thinking about it's our garden, we have to manage it and do everything to just realize it to this inner vision that we have. But I kind of feel like gardening might be changing.
I don't have any inner vision. That's the problem. That it's very organic the way our garden design has happened. But my dad has inner vision. He knows what he's going to do.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, based on what you've, I saw the Gardener's World thing, not live, sadly, because I don't, yeah, but I saw it. And it does look like you've managed to do quite a lot there with based on what you were given to start off with, and managed to attract quite a lot of wildlife.
Yeah, and that's I mean that was like part of the point about doing it, and it was based on so it was Rob that introduced me to the My Nature Watch camera. For people who didn't see it, My Nature Watch camera was basically a build your own wildlife camera project they ran out of RCA, Goldsmiths, and somewhere else. Just to say, if you get people making these kits themselves and installing the software, do they become more sensitized to the natural environment around them? So basically, we bought one, made one with the kids, and I put it outside and realized at that moment that nothing really came to our garden because nothing came to the whole estate because everything had been scraped away, and what they'd left us behind with was just brick walls and turf. And ever since then, yes, the kind of like the project on our garden was kind of like part of that. Going, okay, so how do we get birds to our garden so that we can use this bird camera and see these different things? But suddenly you start treating it like a system and seeing all the different layers and levels of that. But pretty soon you get to, in fact, I'll show the thing that I've managed to find. You get to. Well, this might go weird for a minute. No, not that. Not that. This. So this is the map of our estate that we made as a kind of like a wildlife group. So we are here. But suddenly you start thinking about your kind of your garden in terms of everyone else's garden as well. And you start going, who else is interested in this? What else is on this estate where we have the ability to start thinking about not just a garden, but you start thinking about a street, and then you start thinking about islands and corridors and various different ways of just beginning to almost tackle gardening as a group exercise, or tackle garden, not even is it gardening or is it something else? This is that if is gardening the previous description of close control, get to this individualistic vision within the four walls in your bag? Is this something else? Is this not really gardening, but is there a different name for it? I don't know. But
There's a
go.
there's a permaculture principle which essentially says everything gardens, and it is essentially the principle that you have your own sort of idea of what gardening consists of. You may have your own definition of what that means. You may have deliverables, specific things that you're looking for. Ants, birds, cows, various different sort of wildlife and plants. They're all doing their own form of gardening. They're all sort of seeking to find their niche and produce a yield. And it's quite an interesting way of looking at things, that just to sort of open up the idea of sort of what gardening can be, what gardening means, and who and what gardening can work for.
I love that phrase, everything gardens.
Bill Mollison, one of the sort of the co-creators of permaculture, which this was a nice bit of consciousness raising for me in the last sort of year or so. Was I've been aware of permaculture, but even just the principle of observing and interacting, just seeing what's going on, and that sort of very holistic systems view of things is it's really, really interesting stuff.
So that's a little bit and that shift in perspective, when I think the first time that I heard the kind of like the non-human perspective phrase, I went, okay, I don't really understand it. I don't get. I couldn't do it. But once we started doing the gardening thing, I find it a lot easier. So that everything gardens point is like, so we had lots of aphids on the pear trees. And of course the ants were there farming the aphids on the pear trees. But then that created the conditions for kind of basically a swarm of ladybirds to come in and drop larvae on the pear trees, and then so suddenly everything, like to your point about everything is kind of like gardening in its own way. They're all gardening just within our garden, and it's really that sort of like, it's been one of the ways that when we talk to other people in the estate about this little nature watch group we've got, it's just the talking about thinking like a bird, going sort of like, so a bird doesn't think, oh, I'm going to stop at John's garden because John's garden's great, but I'm not going to go anywhere else. You go, no, it needs to go to Vicky's garden and Tony's garden and such, because they don't see individual gardens, they don't see individual boundaries between estates. And it's just as a really nice way of beginning to bring people into this idea of thinking like something else, and not just thinking of, well, my plot starts here and stops here, so that's all I need to take care of.
It reminds me a little bit of, she couldn't join us today, but Sarah Heitlinger, who is my friend and neighbour and a professor in the human computer interaction group at City University, but she's got a 7-year research fellowship around human and more than human smart cities, and was launching a book a few weeks ago that one of the contributors had been running in Highbury Fields, so in Islington. What were they live action role plays around the human and more than human stakeholders within the park. So it was literally anyone could join, and it was happening over consecutive Saturdays, but people were given roles and masks of like, you're a dog and you're a magpie and you are a person and and with the what kind of unfolds. And there was a really interesting conversation, so on our estate in Hackney, there are going to be 100 new homes built in 3 new blocks around the estate. So it's part of Hackney's social housing commitment, and it's going to be massive. And so there's a big consultation taking place at the moment, and things would come up. And so in these live action role plays around rights, and so this idea of, even when we use like the word citizens, that doesn't speak to every person in a community, let alone non-humans who are participating in an ecosystem. And what does that look like? And at the same time, sitting in kind of consultations around our estate, where people are kind of quite reasonably saying, great, we're going to have loads of wildflowers and green roofs for the bees and butterflies to get their food, but there's also a large percentage of people living on the estate who are experiencing food poverty, and what about them? And this kind of negotiation of how these interactions, or how that sort of kind of coexistence happens. And I guess to me, what's interesting about gardens particularly is the scale of it. It's a scale of kind of experimentation which is much more accessible to many people, and also how, through all the many metaphors that can exist in that space, does it open different sorts of conversations, and what's the physiological, psychological effect of gardening together to have different sorts of conversations that lead to really different outcomes. And I guess that all of that kind of really sparks my interest or curiosity.
It's almost like to build on that everything gardens thing. go, everything gardens, and gardening is a team activity. So whether it's you and all of the other things that live in your garden, or whether it's you and all of the other gardeners who are also working with all the other things that live in their garden, you go, this is a bigger and holistic thing. How many people talk to other people about their garden? Look, nearby.
I think I'm just thinking, following up on that. I don't know how much you guys have come across the idea, Buckminster Fuller's idea around processional impact. So when I started to talk to people, I'll get this wrong because I could have paid more attention at school around physics, which I had done. But basically, this idea that a bee's goal is to gather food for itself, so it's gathering honey and things like that. But its purpose is to pollinate. So the Buckminster Fuller looked at it and said the processional impact of that is therefore that the force in motion is the bee being busy, but the sort of output at 90 degrees to that is the pollination that happens, and that becomes part of that ecosystem. And that's how I try to talk to people, not just in my garden. I do use it in that analogy, and bees do come up quite often. I think people use pollination as an idea that people seem to like, and beekeeping is becoming more popular. But for me, even in my work, and just trying to explore those different sort of consciousness type things of, we all feel like we're trying to make motion forwards, but we may not know the power we're having on others that is going out at 90 degrees, as much as we're going sort of, like, motion is the important thing. And then I think within a garden, that's so powerful, that idea. And I've not come across this idea of everything gardens, because that constant idea of something's doing something, it doesn't know what value it adds to something else, but it's continually, perpetually growing. And that is the idea, I think, of an interconnected system that ultimately is where I hope that people will get to, because that is the joy of living, in my opinion. But it takes a bit of time to get to that.
That's lovely. It's also just maybe popped the word overgrown in my head. People going, "Oh, the garden's overgrown," and you go, "Wow, so it's doing really well then." It's not. It's not a bad thing.
But I think that's the bit again around the kind of needs and expectations, and therefore what people want from their garden. And that's the bit that obviously for us, we're all talking about. I think a very similar kind of perspective on the gardens. But I imagine if you looked at the growth of plastic grass, I don't know what the stats are, but that has become very popular from what I can imagine the growth of that being. And that's probably an idea of this expectation of how people perceive their tidiness, which probably is then linked to your mental health, kind of, what that people expect of you and things like that in your community. So that's a really interesting thing that I probably will spend more time exploring in my own sort of reflections, is how does your own, I suppose, requirement of a garden shift what that needs and expectation is from that space.
That's really
John,
interesting.
you mentioned mindset shift. And there's something that I remember hearing a great deal from people talking about regenerative agriculture at conferences like Groundswell and the Oxford Real Farming Conference, was to say it is not simply just a case of changing your farming practices, or if you want to talk about gardening, changing your gardening practices. The change is not external, the change is here. And it genuinely is a sort of a mindset shift. For example, when you talk about gardening, you talk about farming, you talk about weeds. And weeds there's the old thing about weeds are just plants that were in the wrong place. Weeds have value. So the way to look at weeds is as bioindicators, because certain weeds, for example, nettles will tell you that there's high nitrogen content in the soil, and scented mayweed will tell you where you have compaction, etc., etc. Those weeds have found their niche. They are gardening, and they're giving you information. And it's that thing of sort of turning that way of thinking. If gardening fundamentally for a certain generation or for a certain mindset is about control, it actually becomes sort of almost more about observation and information gathering, really.
Weeds as telemetry.
It occurs to me that I'm much more of a dictator than that. So, as in, I want my garden to be a certain way, and I have an idea of what I like and what I would like it to look like. I've chosen things that that pollinators will like, but I choose them for the colours that I like, and also have quite a lot of tropical plants. I've kind of I've wondered what insects get out of those, I know that, for instance, one that I really wanted, that I liked, Angel's Trumpets, is apparently really like deadly to bees. And so I've chosen not to have that. But I know that there are lots of tropical planting advocates who that's not part of the conversation. So there's a tension between the garden as being a place that gardens itself, and like weeds being indicators and all those sorts of things, and then the sort of gardener as dictator. So yeah, I'm kind of recognizing that in myself and thinking, I don't know if I like that. But maybe there's other spaces outside of a sphere of control that is more yeah, I don't know where to
Yeah,
go.
but this, I think that points into this, I don't know, nascent thought I have of kind of let you go. If a garden was an entire ecosystem and you forced it to act in a particular way, etc., and nothing else could get to it or get in of it and so on, you go, then you are having particular effects. But the more we think of gardening as a kind of like, you know, a team activity, a hobby across an estate or a city or a region or whatever else, you go, but there's space within Brighton for you to have the garden you like. And for the person next door to have the garden they like, and the person next door to that to have the garden. The worst thing would be if it was all homogeneous. I know the worst thing would be if it's all plastic grass. So the sort of the thinking going, okay, so I'm doing this, but I'm part of a kind of like, if bees or birds or whatever other insect is flying over, they can choose to be here or choose to be there or go to the weeds down the playground at the bottom of the road or whatever else.
I like the idea of that connective tissue between the different things. So it's made me think about the strip of land that goes along the back of all of our gardens between the railway and the housing. It's tiny, but there's foxes that live there.
Who technically manages it?
It belongs to Network Rail. So it's a marginal space that I never even knew that or considered it until they needed to do some work on that cutting, and they had to agree a sort of a deed of easement, like with the house owners, because they wanted to drill into the cliffs underneath the garden. So that was kind of interesting. They wanted to put a restriction on the kind of plants and how deep the roots could grow, because they wanted to put these bolts in. So they were kind of the easement was giving them permission to own that bit of ground underneath our ground.
So yeah.
The householder normally owns like below the property as well, but because of the nature of the railway cutting, they wanted to own that bit where the bolts would go in. So yeah, it's kind of it's interesting about who owns and who gets to choose where things go. And also, like, Network Rail is a massive landowner, and obviously owns an awful lot of buddleia bushes and stuff.
So that's interesting so they must have, I guess, Network Rail level policy and go, this is how we as a landowner will act upon our land in these various different places. One of the things we've started poking at here is going, because our estate is one of these newer estates where it's not council adopted, and the developer have basically said, oh, you can just have a sort of like directors from your estate who you will elect, and they will run the management company that then look after all of the green spaces and the roads and whatever else in perpetuity, which, well, in a medium term thing, I think it's a terrible idea, and eventually governments will get rid of it. But for the short term, it's quite interesting because it's going to, oh, hang on, so wait a minute, if this is our estate, literally, we can decide what the policy is. And the directors who are on the board went, oh, well, maybe we should have a policy. So the idea of setting out a policy of this is our standpoint on how we treat the land, what we do and don't use, what we are providing space for. suddenly becomes a possibility on an estate like this. And I wonder if in other estates as well, to start being able to say, here are 5 principles by which we want to give the gardeners a contract to say operate within the bounds of these principles, because this is how we want the land looked after.
So you could combat, say, for instance, obviously Brighton Council has decided to use glyphosate again as a weed killer. So you can set on your estate a rule that there won't be glyphosate.
Yeah.
Glyphosate the other way.
Yeah, so we can sort of set a rolling annual policy that can only be changed at the AGM to say this is how we want this land treated, and because it's not council run, I think eventually it should be council run, but that's a longer term discussion. But because in the moment it's not, you can say, well, we can experiment with principles and rules which will allow it to nature to thrive in different ways, while still, and this is the interesting thing about the regenerative thing, because you have to go balance the environmental with the social and the economic. So you have to be regenerative for all of these different things. So you need a set of principles that will be ecologically regenerative, but also socially regenerative. So that's kind of like it's agreed, and the people who live here are agreed that these are the principles they want on their estate. But then also economically regenerative in the sense of it's not going to suck all the money out of the budget to do this, which can also be used for repairing streetlights or whatever else and so on, or it sends people's bills flying up because we all have to pay this surcharge on top of everything else. So it's kind of like it's the opportunity space is there, but it's balancing those 3 things, which I think is an interesting opportunity and one we have to try and get right.
It's interesting when you say that, because we had in May of Mow May or No Mow May, so on our estate, which is, there was the option for it to be council run, and it was voted that it's a tenant management organisation, but effectively Hackney has a biodiversity policy in all of its the spaces that it looks after, which is No Mow May, and in the estate there's kind of 3 green spaces, and the majority of them leaseholders had planted bulbs and sown wildflowers. And so on May the 1st, the guy who's one of a team of kind of caretakers is on his ride-on mower, just kind of mowing through everything. And then there was this really difficult kind of confrontation of leaseholders who were really frustrated that this was in breach of the biodiversity policy, and they've been kind of stewarding these spaces with the caretaker saying, I've been told by the TMO to mow, so please can you move out the way, because otherwise I'm going to be in trouble. And then something which kind of turned into a really difficult, almost kind of class and education issue, which was effectively leaseholders versus tenants, with the broadly tenants saying we want our spaces to look nice and tidy, and what is this kind of wilderness, and effectively the leaseholders, so generally speaking, like more affluent, more educated, all kind of lobbying for, and in something almost as small as who mows the grass or when, kind of brings to life all of these different issues with the, even if the head of kind of Hackney Biodiversity hosted like an evening like session in the local pensioners hall, it's like, but also there's the ability to show up for these things and have to manage childcare or the night shift, or, and so I guess it's, yeah, it's I mean, I think Rosie, you said up front, like with the sweet peas, like the word entangled, but even on like this sort of micro scale, there's still all of these issues woven together in deeply entrenched ways. And how is it possible to, which I think probably happens in a whole bunch of small interactions, like consistently and over time, to unpick all of these things, because ultimately people want a nice place to live that's safe for kids and elderly people, with clean air and all of this stuff. Like there's no conflict around that, but the how these decisions are made and why they're made is still quite difficult to navigate.
There's definitely transparency on why things are happening is a massive thing. So we also had a no more money area down the bottom of the estate, and so the board of directors said, "Oh, we're hearing from some people that they don't want it. It looks untidy. There's a fire risk and so on." So they put out a survey to everyone on the estate and said, "Like, go to this link, do this survey, whatever else." So the kind of the quant figures were basically 80% of people were in favour. Only about 16 or 17% of people voted in total. So you go, there's this big extreme in the middle who clearly don't care enough to go onto your survey and vote or whatever else. But there's more positivity at that end than there is negativity at that end. But because it was almost unannounced, it was just like this was just the thing that was happening. You realised that part of the thing was that nobody had any visibility of how this set of directors and the gardening contract and all of this stuff actually happens. No one really understands how decisions are made because there's an absolute lack of. You don't have the kind of the built-in election thing of a council where you go, oh well, if I could complain to the council if something was happening or whatever else because I know that I elect my council officials and this would happen and they're equipped to deal with that. Here it's almost like we're trying to busk up council level responsiveness to things which is left behind by housing developers who've not really kind of done enough to create that in the first instance. Yes, Jenny, I agree. It is kind of like the opportunity for participatory democracy is here and it's alive. And it's bumping into the problem which my Catalan friend Elizabeth once referred to as el cuatro gat, which is basically a Catalan phrase, just a few cats, only 4 cats. So basically you do something, you try and do something, and then only 4 cats turn up. This is the sort of like, there's a participation problem sometimes if it's going to let people don't know when it's happening, what's happening, where to go, whatever else. So, and I think a lot of the social elements around regenerative stuff is about trying to just make that more available to people to understand what's going on and where they can participate should they choose to that time.
I think it's interesting that the value of land in terms of what it can provide, particularly at a time when people are struggling, things like even feeding themselves and things within society. And I don't know if anyone's read the Book of Trespass, which was a book I read a few years ago, which was quite interesting, looking at who owns the amount of land and the access that we have to the land that we have. And that I think is really quite eye-opening because obviously access to a garden is a huge privilege even to have. And I think that then you start looking at that outwardly and you start looking at how much land is used for things like golf courses and like, do they have policies for sort of different levels of permaculture? I can't see it myself. But they have huge amounts of land at their disposal. And then you start looking at different things. And that macroeconomic lens is really interesting because it does look at how we're all kind of trying to utilize the space that we have access to. But in terms of the land mass of the UK, there's a hell of a lot of it that we as normal citizens don't have access to, which is really quite surprising.
As a Scot, it's very bizarre having moved down here compared to Scotland, where the kind of right to roam is much greater. The sort of like just how few spaces you're allowed to wander into.
I recently finished reading the Who Owns England book that's by Guy Shrubsole, who's very much linked in with, I forget who wrote the Book of Trespass. Maybe it was even him, or maybe it was
I think Nick Hayes, maybe.
That's right. Yeah, it's on my shelf actually to read. But yeah, my head went to a similar place in terms of it almost went bigger. Like I think it was Lizzie, you said that what's quite nice about gardens is they're a scale that we can understand. And kind of because I've been reading this book, I was thinking of the stats that he kind of talks through, and it's 5% of England is domestic homes. And of that 5%, only about 70% is actually owner occupied. So a lot of those are obviously, we've already talked about tenants and leaseholders, but there's other ways of occupying beyond those. I'm sure that I'm forgetting right now, but that 5% I don't know, on one hand, I think there's a kind of big scale tension, which is that 5% is such a small proportion of England, that like it feels almost insignificant. But then on the other hand, I think it's like, but it's where a lot of the people are. So like if we can shift that, and that's where the mindset argument comes in, like you have that opportunity to shift so many people who are then going to have a knock-on effect on much larger areas. But yeah, I think tapping into that land reform kind of is super interesting.
And doing it, so Jenny's just mentioned the Sussex Bay initiative, so about the which for me is almost like it's the sea half of the wheel to waves thing, which is another kind of like Sussex project, and it's the trying to break down a problem. The land ownership problem seems too big and too massive and too legislative. And we've had the garden and green spaces coordinator from Wheel to Waves round to the estate last week. I'll just show you the map. So this is the Wheel to Waves project, which basically started out with NEP down here, and then a farm up here, and then someone had the kind of like the farm on the coast, and he said, "Oh, I'm the missing bit. I can get you down to the waves." So this is the plan, that they are trying to join up various different landowners, now green spaces, now gardens as well, just to say, okay, so actually we can build a nature corridor, and it requires commitment, but it doesn't require legislative change in the same way. So actually, if we can sort of make it's social engineering of who owns the parts in between these that we can persuade to say, look, if you do this bit and you do this bit and you do this bit, then we can join something up across Sussex in a really interesting way. And for me, it becomes a kind of like an exemplar project, so that other places in the UK can look at it and go, oh, well, actually, if you've managed to do that without legislative change, what could we do without legislative change as well? And if you get enough benefit from it, maybe you start getting legislative change.
Totally. And the other area as well I don't know whether it's worth connecting in with the gardens debate, and maybe it's kind of blowing things out too big, but the allotments, this is drawing on the same book. Guy Shrubshaw kind of talks about allotments and county farms, which I find quite interesting as kind of potential mechanisms for people who don't have access to land immediately to get involved with some of the gardening discussions. But then maybe that, yeah, apparently there is a right for everyone in the UK to, it may not be the UK, it may be England, a right to ask the council to buy land for an allotment. That exists, that right apparently exists.
Oh, really? So if they can't give you an allotment, you can say, well, you should be able to provide me with an allotment, so.
Yeah, but councils have just been stalling and saying they don't have, well, they're obviously under enormous funding pressure and haven't had a lot of cash on hand, and so they don't really want to spend that cash on buying land. And also, if the land values are so high, then that makes it impractical. But that legislative right apparently exists. But I find that really intriguing.
It's really strange.
It's probably taking us off in the wrong direction. It's not really, in a way, it's gardens, in a way, it's not.
I think it is, though, because it's that thing of, you go to the bird perspective and you get again and you go, a bird will not differentiate between my garden and an allotment. It will be places in which there is kind of like trees and cover and bugs and other things. So you go, if they don't distinguish, then neither would we, if we're trying to think from a wildlife perspective.
Well, does this tie into some of these shifts in gardening that we were talking about earlier on? I sort of believe that, I might be slightly wrong here, but when we were at war, people were encouraged to grow in their own garden, if they could. So you had a sort of generation then that was kind of, to sort of Jenny's point earlier, maybe was kind of quite proud about the garden, but from that very practical perspective. And then maybe there was a period, I don't know, between then and now where it became more of a control thing, to your point, John, around people just wanting gardens to look nice. And either some people were really good gardeners and connected with that, or some people just kind of disconnected with it, and it just became a space outside that you never sort of touch with. And now maybe we're finding this interesting balance of people wanting to connect back again with that, for a variety of reasons. The one thing that's kind of just hover around in my mind, but I don't know whether it's relevant to the conversation, but has anyone heard of like ecotones? So there's sort of these areas where, and I think, was it you, Nathan, rather, that mentioned something earlier on about zones. You basically have this kind of interesting pattern in nature where an ecotone is where one kind of habitat connects to another, and you have this zone of kind of blurring, like, so like where a forest meets a field or something like that. But apparently those areas are really richly abundant. You have this thing called edge effect abundance that happens in those kind of areas where like two habitats meet each other.
Got it all going on in ecotones. Yeah, it's because it's a place of exchange. It's a place of transition between
because you
different
kind of got to.
ecological
But there's also
communities.
this interesting principle of like the sort of species that tend to thrive in those zones where there's kind of are more generalist as opposed to specialist. So if you're a creature that likes the woods or the forest, you might not thrive in an ecotone. But there's some principle here, I think, maybe about trying to find nature corridors and connecting up and gardens where there's something around recognizing diversity of habitats. I think that like not everyone's garden needs to be the same and probably shouldn't be the same, because actually if you can create these kind of spaces where, you know, I don't know, Andy's garden is overgrown and a certain kind of habitat, that might be quite beneficial for it to be quite diverse to someone else's on the estate who might be something different. But it's trying to avoid this kind of monotony as well. Like to your point, John, like when you inherited the house, it was just like it's a slab of turf. It didn't really have anything going on for it. And I think these nature corridor ideas are really good just to try and see like, well, what else is happening in this same, if this is just one contiguous habitat, like a variety of habitats, what can I add to that mix? I don't have to necessarily duplicate what is happening elsewhere. I can sort of create something that's interesting.
And actually, sort of like the new build estates, that is something I'm really interested in, just because like we've been on one and we're now reaching a point where there's a new government coming in who've got big house building ambitions, but also big environmental ambitions. And you go, right, okay, you need to think about how many housing estates you're putting up and how, if that's true. But to your point about the homogeneous nature of the gardens, all the gardens were turf, but even the stuff that they did plant was all the same. So there's a Sussex hedge, which tends to be used, called Red Robin, and it's just everywhere. It's like everyone's front hedge was just the same the whole way round the estate. But it's terrible as an actual hedge for sparrows and stuff to nest in, because it's not dense enough and predators get in really easily. So suddenly they go, just because they had lots of it and they could sort of like put it around the whole estate and make it look nice, you go, well, that's great, but you've made it a really hard place for particular species and stuff to nest. But you've given everyone the same thing, so they're going to be less likely to get rid of it. Whereas, why isn't it in the same way that they say, like, what sort of kitchen do you want, or what sort of bathroom do you want on a new build estate? It's kind of like, which one of the 5 types of gardens do you want?
It might tie into some of what Lizzie was saying earlier around that conflict between the council kind of clearing it all and making it tidy for everyone, or leaving it overgrown so that certain people, you know, if they can, maybe it doesn't have to be either or. I mean, I know it depends on the space and it depends on how much you can create that diversity within that space, but it'd be lovely to think you could try to get, you know, like maybe we do have a growing patch as well.
Well, so this is what I raised in the consultation, which is we have challenges like there are I mean, it's a significant minority of kids on the estate who will drop out of school when they're 16 and join local gangs, and they'll do it because they will risk being imprisoned or stabbed, but they could be earning 30k as 16-year-olds. Like it's and to me, it's there are skills on the estate. There's I mean, it's like Broadway Market is now a London tourist destination every Saturday, and there are, you know, it's a place with market stalls where produce could be could be solved. There are elderly people who are vulnerable, as became like apparent during the pandemic, where there was mutual aid and people were delivering meals to each other. And there are people experiencing food insecurity, and we have space. So to me, it's like, how can we start this process of growing where the kids, when they're 13 or 14, are getting effectively Saturday gigs of like selling produce at the stalls, are involved in community cooking, are effectively building relationships and making connections that offer other alternatives, that when that point when they're 16 comes, it's actually, I'm networked into other places and I have skills, because I could go get a job in a kitchen. I could, like, there's City Farms, there's the Hackney School of Food, there's like this whole ecosystem which is growing here. And I guess for me, that's where it's like, I see so much potential in the both and, as opposed to either or, and connect all of the dots, because all of these things really are connected. And part of me wonders whether some of the problem is because the governance of all of this stuff and the budgets sit in such siloed places. And so in our case, there's the council, but then there's the architects, and then there's the planners, and then there's the like, there's just a lot of people who should want the same outcomes, but I don't know whether ever actually sit in a room together and think about how all of these things connect.
It's like social gardening.
Yeah.
I am going to suggest that, given we've blasted through that hour, how has that happened? But there we go. That's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you all for joining. I'm going to stop recording now. We can say goodbye and things. But I'll stop recording. Thank you.